I'd now like to introduce our speakers. Holly Sutton is a partner in the Labor and Employment Group of Farella Braun Martel, where she provides advice and counsel to clients in multiple industries, including technology, media, insurance, wine, agriculture, retail, and banking. Erin Hastings is a certified public accountant with more than 18 years experience providing audit and advisory services. She has expertise in regulatory auditing requirements, business strategy and planning, internal control reviews, and reporting oversight, among many other areas. I'll now turn it over to our presenters to begin the presentation.
Hey everyone, welcome. Thanks for the introduction, Amelia. It was so nice to see some familiar names on today's attendee list, and I sort of wish we could see your faces. It'd be nice to see some friendly faces as well. Just to tell you a little bit about the history of our sort of partnership that we have, Erin and I, is we actually met a while back in an ACG event and started brainstorming about this topic, and that there was a little bit of a void right now in compensation analysis. And at the same time, there's a lot of attention on this subject and looking at pay data. And so we started collaborating. And then in the interim, of course, we had a pandemic. And then we've also had some new legislation, which made the potential need or benefit of this type of analysis even more acute. So we decided to collaborate on this presentation and share with all of you sort of some new ideas about how to approach compensation, data reporting and analysis, and along with some of the legal requirements that come into play. So my background, I know some of you, I've been at Farella for more years than I admit these days. I am the head of our employment practice group. We have about 8 dedicated attorneys in our group, 2 other partners along with myself, and a nice cadre of associates.
Great, thanks, Holly. And I'm happy to be here as well. I'm Erin Hastings. I'm an advisory and assurance partner with Seiler CPA firm. I have about 16 people on our team that are dedicated to advisory and assurance services. And as part of our business intelligence services, we offer these independent compensation equity analyses. And in order to do that, we use a combination of data analytics and assurance procedures. So we'll talk about how that works today. This is our discussion overview. We're going to bring up to speed today on the basics of a compensation equity analysis, and as Holly mentioned, the latest research and laws and best practices. And as Amelia mentioned, we have a limited amount of time, but we do want to make this interactive. So feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll get to them if we can during the presentation so that we can answer questions in real time. And then we'll try to leave a little time at the end too, if you have anything that you want to save to the end. Just know that if it's not, there's a lot that we don't know still about the developing law. And so if it's not a quick answer, we might need to table it. And like I said, so if we're going to give you an overview of what a compensation equity analysis is, but first what we want to do is ground ourselves and talk about the big news, which is California's new law, SB 973, the new pay data reporting law.
Thanks, Erin. So, knowing that most of you are thinking at the same time about, sort of big picture things that that you are going to tackle this year, but also very attuned to deadlines, we thought we'd start with this new reporting requirement, which has a deadline of March 31. It's the first of its kind in the nation, essentially, in which the DFEH is now requiring larger employers, so that's employers over 100 employees, I think probably most of you on this call, to complete for the first time this data report that is submitted to the DFEH. And we have a little bit of guidance about it, but it's essentially requiring you to run the numbers, if you don't already have them, on your employees, and then break it down by race, ethnicity, gender, and also by job classification and pay band. So just to walk you through the details on that, if you're first of all wondering, am I covered by this? The way that they count the 100 employees is it's both full and part-time. So they're basically just looking at who's on your payroll. And if you just even have just one employee in California and you have 99 outside of California, you will trigger this reporting requirement. I put the pay data reporting website in the slide there, and this will come out to you after the presentation. There's a lot that they still have to do, and this is, not uncommon when the legislature passes something and then the regulators are kind of catching up. They do have on the website that they are planning to release a template. Now, for many of you, who are familiar with the DFVH, in the past they've promised to come up with materials that then were either delayed or were provided at the last minute. So we'll talk a little bit more about the data in case you don't want to wait for the template. But there is some pretty good guidance there. And we're just going to quickly give you an overview. But the idea is that you get to choose a snapshot anywhere between that October 1 and December 31 of 2019 to make this report. And that's important because if you have a fluctuating workforce, one particular payroll period may differ greatly. As Amelia mentioned, I have a lot of winery clients, and they're in the middle of harvest in October, November. Everything's quiet by December, so you may want a little extra time to run your numbers through different payroll periods and think about which one you want to choose. As I mentioned in the slide there, it's your choice which of those payroll periods you want to report on. So the job categories are predefined. They're EEO job categories, which may be familiar to you because there previously were federal reporting requirements using these categories that were more focused on race and ethnicity. And they're broken down into sort of 1.1 and 1.2 at the top, and then others. But this category, I thought, deserved a little bit of extra attention in our presentation, just because for many, larger businesses, you're going to have skewed numbers up in that C-suite, and you have, fortunately, we do have two different categories of managers. So you have your executive and senior level managers, and then you have your first and mid-level managers that allow you to differentiate within those categories, so that you don't have a CEO who's really skewing the numbers. If your CEO, like most, is male and Caucasian, being compared in the same category as mid-level managers. So these are broken down, and then the other 8 categories are more based on actual job type. Go to that next. Yeah. So we've got professionals, technicians, sales workers, administrative support. You can see the list there down, the last one being service workers. And that may take some time for you to sort out, if you haven't already been through this exercise, which jobs go in which categories. And, it may require some legal support, in addition to HR. So as I mentioned, this is similar. Some of you may have been through this exercise for the federal EEO reports. One big difference is that in California, they are allowing 3 gender categories. So, you're seeing a differentiator there in California from the feds, which just use the traditional male and female. And there is pretty good guidance that will be applicable to this form from the EEOC guidance for their own previously required forms, which, just a little background on there, it was first required in the prior administration, and then that was essentially discontinued under the Trump administration. The courts ordered that they had to continue at least for a couple of years. So some of you, as I said, might have already have gathered some of this data. And then we get into pay bands. So they're looking at annualized earnings, and the pay bands start at $19,239, which I think is based on the federal minimum wage. And then the top pay band is 208,000 and over. So again, in the Bay Area, we're going to be, I think, we typically have more people in that top category, and that may have an effect on your data as well. And then that next bullet point is it will require that you report the total number of hours worked during the year. So it's a snapshot, and what we're thinking is for many employers that are now having to gather this data and maybe looking at it in this way for the first time, this may be an opportunity where there's value to you in having a third party like Siler come in and help you with that compensation analysis and help you make some of the decisions about where you're categorizing certain jobs and how to run those numbers, and understanding what that entails and what the implications might be.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Holly. That was a really good overview of the legal developments. We're going to just take a step back here and talk about what is a compensation equity analysis outside of this requirement that's due in March, or in preparation for it rather. I just want to make a note first about what we call it. You do hear some people use the term audit, pay equity audit. And as a longtime 20-year auditor, I like to be very careful about how I word this. So we call it a compensation equity analysis. There are no standards for pay equity audits set forth by the AICPA. So until sometime as that happens, right now we're just considering these to be analyses, and they're governed by consultation standards or attestation standards. We use those standards to govern these engagements. And compensation equity, another nomenclature important item to note, is compensation equity does not mean paying all employees equally. I'm sure this group knows that, but because of course some positions are valued more than others, but the goal of an analysis like this is really to find out, for a point in time or over a period of time, do disparities exist? And if they do, and likely there are some, are they limited to certain portions of the employee population, like one office or department? And can they be explained by some legitimate business justification other than a protected class characteristic? So first we want to get into the data. We're going to talk about how the analysis works, but we want to talk a little bit about the data first. And we'll explain a few things that pretty much everyone in the corporate counsel seat should know about pay equity. Oh, Holly, you're muted.
Thank you. From the studies that are out there, and there've been a few, we're seeing this fairly persistent gender wage gap in a large number of occupations, almost all of them. So, that's important background for in-house counsel, because it means if you start running this data and you're seeing disparities, you're not alone, right? In fact, it's almost it would be I think a surprise if you're running the data and you're not seeing disparities, particularly for running this analysis for really the first time. So that's important background to preparing yourself to pull and present this data.
Yeah, so we have a couple of slides here on just data. This is a study by McKinsey and Lean In that also shows that the gender pay gap is everywhere. It's even in jobs dominated by women. You'll see like nurses and teachers are on here. And then you go to the other positions where you see women managers earn 23% less than their counterparts on average. And this data is just all women. It can be much more pronounced if you look at it by race or ethnicity, which we aren't doing today just simply because we want to have a more general conversation. But I do encourage you to check out the data. This website actually has quite a few interesting pieces of research. And then another thing to note is some people do assume that the gap is explained by the fact that women are more likely to take maternity leave or seek lower positions because they want a flexible schedule, but they did control for that in this study and found that that does not fully explain the gap, and neither do differences in education, experience, and occupation, because this was a controlled study. I guess one more thing before I move on to this from this slide. In 2017, there was a study by Pew Research Center. They found that 42% of women say that they have experienced gender discrimination at work. And one of the most commonly reported forms of the discrimination is earning inequality. That was at 25% of women say that they have earned less than a man doing the same job, while just only 5% of men would say the same thing.
And then this chart we thought might be useful for this group because, we're predominantly in the Bay Area. We have a more educated workforce. And I think that there's a sense that often that means you have, a smaller gap. But this chart actually indicates that the advanced degrees have a higher gap in terms of gender disparities. So just a little more background as you prepare to undertake this analysis and understand what you might be up against.
Great. So we want to talk about why this is relevant right now. Just as Holly mentioned earlier, that pay equity is really big news these days. There's a global discussion going on around race and gender equality with Black Lives Matter and Me Too and Time's Up movements over the last few years. And companies are doing a lot more about talking about what they can do to ensure that people are being paid fairly and given equal opportunities. And then we have the pandemic and the increase in remote workforce, which raised a lot of questions about compensation equity that didn't exist prior to the pandemic. Somebody moves to Sacramento, gets a pay cut, and then knows that their coworker in San Francisco, both of them working from home, are making very different salaries and feel that it's not fair. So there's just a tremendous amount of pressure on companies right now to get compensation equity right. And the concept really, though, is nothing new. We've seen those high profile allegations of gender-based pay discrimination at major companies over the last decade, Google, Microsoft, Nike, Goldman Sachs, and on. But right now, it's not really that like one woman might sue us. It's bigger. It's more of a business risk, and it's about recruiting and retention and communication with your employees. And it's also becoming more about board governance as well. We have Goldman Sachs now saying that they won't take companies public if they don't have at least one diverse board member. And California has another new law that is going to require all public companies headquartered in California to diversify their boards racially, ethnically, and in terms of gender identity. So those California companies are going to need to have at least one board member from an underrepresented community by the end of 2021, and at least 2 or 3, depending on the board size, by the end of 2022. So that means there is going to be a shift where all of these companies will have at least one person at the very top who is statistically more likely to have personally experienced pay inequity and have a keen understanding of the impact that it has on the business. And in addition to that, in the board, you have ESG getting a lot more attention. There's 25% of the Fortune 500 now have an ESG committee. If in case ESG doesn't ring a bell for you, I can do a quick summary. E is for environment, and that's what's been really big up until now. That's energy, carbon emissions, resource usage, and waste. And that's what's had a lot of attention and disclosure for the last decade. S is social, which includes things like labor relations, diversity, equity, cybersecurity, consumer trust, and just all the ways to remember that the company operates in a bigger, broader, social, diverse world. And we've really seen S surpass E in popularity in the last year, driven by COVID, the pandemic, and just all these social justice issues. And then G is for governance. And really, I think that should actually go first because everything really starts with governance, making sure that management's thinking about how they align their policies with the strategy and looking at the internal systems and practices and controls that they use to govern themselves and make effective decisions. compliance with the law and meeting external stakeholder requirements. And compensation equity is where S and G meet. So that's social and governance, putting into place policies whereby you look at compensation equity and make sure that it matches up with the policies and the disclosures that you're making on the S side. So we're seeing a lot more discussion about this in boardrooms. And the last thing I want to talk about on this slide, because Holly is going to cover the legal changes, is just transparency. There are so many websites these days and ways to find out what coworkers are making. And as a result, a lot of companies are trying to get ahead of this and instituting some level of pay transparency, which doesn't mean publishing all salary data so that everyone can see. It's just about publishing some level of it and giving somewhat of a spectrum of transparency and disclosure. So transparency and disclosure are likely to be something that is not going to go away with regard to compensation equity, and it's highly likely to be something that every organization is expected to do and know and discuss in the future. And then that's just a summary of the business and peer pressure around compensation equity. And Holly's now going to talk about the law, the recent changes.
That's right. So we have a few legal background, a few legal requirements that play in the background to this concept that some of you will already be familiar with. And one of them is the California Fair Pay Act, which is right. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I'm sure all of you are thinking, okay, so I create this report that I'm going to submit to the DFEH. The DFEH so far is announcing that they're not planning to do anything with this data. So, you're not right now, we're not worried about governmental enforcement. But all of you, I think, are already thinking, now I've got this data, it's discoverable. So if you get a claim, arguably, you're going to have to turn it over. And we'll talk a little bit more about attorney-client privilege as you're gathering the data and analyzing the data. But eventually, you're going to have this data somewhere. And I think it won't be unusual also for your employees to ask for it. So sort of thinking ahead that, it's likely that you're going to end up sharing the data. California was the first to pass. There's the California Fair Pay Act. As I said, there's a federal counterpart. New York has passed a similar law. So as we often are, we're sort of leading a trend here. Erin, I think you were going to mention the UK developments.
Yeah, so actually first we have a question in the chat around the pay data snapshot. Right. I think I had the same question. I think that we have a typo in our deck that says it's for 2019.
It should be for, that's right. It should be for 2020.
Yeah, we put the deck together last year. So I think it was a little shift of what is prior year. So we'll fix that before the deck goes out to the whole group. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah. So yes, the UK law, very interesting. You can Google this right now while we're on the discussion. You could Google UK pay gap data and then type in, you'll see there's a site and you can type in any company that you can think of that has more than 250 employees in the UK. So any, Google, JP Morgan, whatever international company you want to type in there. And their pay data is right there. It's a very high level summary of what the pay gap is at each of these companies. And it gives no context whatsoever. It just tells you that average men at this company make generally more than the average woman and by how much. And this came to pass a few years ago. So they've been really doing a lot of research at the very big macro level and have found that just the act of having these companies report it and have it out there has actually decreased the gap incrementally. I think the 2019 to 2020 gap closed by 2 or 3%, just year over year, which is pretty phenomenal when you consider that the gap is around 23%. So I don't think we're going there right now with the California data. I don't think the government is ready to process that kind of information right now, lots of other priorities. But it just kind of gives you a hint of, what's in demand, what other countries are doing, and also it just incentivizes you to just try to stay one step ahead of the information and what people are going to be doing with it and talking about it.
That's right. Yeah. And then the other point to keep in mind is you're already required to have pay bands available if applicants ask for them. And it's funny because that law's been in effect for a while now, I think 2 years. And still I have clients who are caught by surprise that you're required to have that information available. So that's another, if you would already have it, it's another potential advantage to this kind of analysis, proactive analysis. So just to talk a little bit about the Fair Pay Act, if you haven't yet had to manage these claims, the California version, which is where we focus because it is more rigorous than its federal counterpart, requires that you provide equal pay for employees who perform substantially similar work. So that's the hard part, is it's not just same title, same precise job duties, but substantially similar work. And we're still early enough along with this law that we don't have a lot of good case law and guidance. But essentially, you're going to take substantially similar work and compare employees in one gender or one race to employees of another, and you want those to be the same. And if they're not, you have potential exposure. So what is substantially similar work? That's really the key to this analysis. And we do have some guidance there in terms of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. But I think all of you will agree that there's a lot of gray area. I like responsibility. We tend to look at metrics, right? If you've got managers, both have the title of managers, but one has a much smaller budget, much smaller number of direct reports, or much less sophisticated work than another. I think we can differentiate those. But skill and effort, skills, maybe we can argue that there's certain educational differences. But I think it's hard to find people who would feel that their job requires less effort than others. So it'll be interesting to see how these claims play out. I will add that when it was first passed, we had a lot of concerns we were going to get a flood of litigation, but we don't yet have a whole lot of guidance in terms of published cases. So a little more on the Fair Pay Act. This concept of comparing only people who work at the same establishment does not apply to this analysis. So you're looking at people throughout your organization. Now, as Erin mentioned, now that we have people kind of spreading out, many of them leaving the more expensive areas and moving to other places, that would definitely be a differentiator, which enables employers to look at the cost of living and setting wages. That's that's something that's not specific to somebody's gender or race.
And Holly, we have a question in the comments about that topic, actually, about comparing pay across states, borders. How do you take into account geographical differences in the job market or global versus US?
Those are exactly the questions. Now, the good news about the pay data reporting form is there is room for comments. So I think, Victoria, that's the kind of differentiator you probably want to include in your pay data report, which is, we've got geographical differences here, which account for these disparities. But in a Fair Pay Act claim, that would also be a differentiator. But it has to account for the entire pay difference. So if you had some people working in a different state, let's say Oregon, and you were comparing Oregon employees with California employees, you want to make sure that there's consistency within those states, right? That's another part of the law, that you can't just say, well, somebody works in another state and therefore can't be compared. We want to be able to really show that the differential in that job market and in that office is consistent. So then, some of the follow-on parts of the Fair Pay Act that require additional caution for employers is, of course, you can't retaliate against anybody who seeks to enforce the law. You can't prohibit employees from discussing or inquiring about their coworkers' wages. So when I read this and I think about the pay data reporting form, and we see how those things come together, we're anticipating that you may have employees who are asking to see this data. And you're not required to provide it, but you cannot prevent them from asking their coworkers what they're earning. And of course, we're seeing on a lot of these websites now, Glassdoor and others, where people are voluntarily disclosing this information. So our takeaway is you may want to get ahead of this, and as we move towards more transparency, you may want to be prepared for that. So as I mentioned, there are defenses under the Fair Pay Act, seniority, merit. Merit's one I just wanted to spend a minute on because in order to rely on merit, you need to have a fairly robust performance evaluation system. And that's almost deserving of its own separate presentation, but just something to think about as you, if you're anticipating differences that would require you to point to these bona fide factors. You may want to focus a little bit more on your performance evaluations or your merit systems if you're going to be relying on that to differentiate between earnings. And then finally, you cannot rely on prior salary. So it was almost, traditional that incoming recruits would be asked, well, what's your current salary? And salary was often set the new salary was set on the prior salary, and you cannot do that anymore. As you're probably aware, you can't ask applicants what their prior earnings were. And really there's a push to set earnings and salary based on the job. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept that by relying on prior salary, if that salary was set in a biased fashion, it just perpetuates the bias and the discrimination. So the state has said, you need to set salaries independently based on the value at your business. So this is Labor Code 432.3, which was passed back in 2018. I think some employers are still getting this information because the applicant can voluntarily disclose their prior salary if they choose, but it's a little bit risky. I had a lot of questions when the law first came into effect about whether you should even accept that information. And of course, the key is to make sure it doesn't look like you requested it informally. But the idea here is that you should have a pay scale available that you can provide to applicants that says this is the range on this job, and that you should be setting that independent of what the candidate was making at their prior jobs. So I get a lot of questions, which is, well, what if they tell me they want the job, but it has to be not less than X, based on what they were making before. Of course, you're entitled to pay more and to adjust your scale, but it also means that anyone else who's in that position is going to get a raise, right? So you've got to keep that internal equity in your system.
I mute myself. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Holly, about the bump up. I think that's forgotten a lot, and often the reason why we see disparities in our clients as well. Just that market benchmarking to market and making it competitive pay. That's the factor there. So we already said that equal pay does not mean paying all employees equally. Fair pay is also totally subjective and in the eye of the beholder. And then competitive pay, which you're talking about, market-based. Like in a perfect world, you're going to align all three of those things, but it's always going to be a little bit of a scramble to make sure that all three of those things are in balance as you want them to be. And that is why having some sort of data analytic around compensation and having some sort of method for management and the board to really be able to see and understand what's going on in the salary and greater compensation within the company is a really good thing. So what you want to do is find some sort of policy and some sort of reporting model that will help you to meet all three of these criteria. And you want to establish something that would have good optics. So similar to what we talked about with this UK information, what would somebody say if they saw just your flat raw pay gap information? People are going to draw their own conclusions. And certainly California, although we don't think they're going to do anything with this, they will have that information. So it just is a matter of figuring out what is your worst case story and understanding why it is the way that it is so that you can stay one step ahead of the story. Holly, you mentioned that there will be footnotes that you can provide to the state, but you won't really know what to put in the footnotes unless you do some sort of proactive analysis. In that way you can make changes and head off conclusions that other people might draw from that raw data. I see a question around if a company says we don't want to strive to be competitive in pay, is that an issue? It would probably be an issue, I think, maybe with recruiting. I don't know, Holly, if you've seen anybody take a stand on that.
Well, and you're not required to be competitive. You're just required to provide that pay band. So if if your pay band is, this job is between 105 and 110,000 a year, and your candidate comes in and says, well, I'm at 112, you can say, we're capped at 110 for this job, and we're not competing with your prior employer. That's completely acceptable. But if you were to hire that applicant and increase your pay band to 115, if that's what he wants, then you would also be required to look at everyone else in that position, and they may be in line for a raise as well, right? In order to make sure you have that horizontal consistency.
Yeah. And to that point, this is a quote. So just thinking about like, well, what do you want to be? Do you want to be competitive? Do you want to be equal, transparent? This is sort of a vote for transparency. This is a quote from the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls that Holly and I thought really rang true based on the data and just common sense, that when employees do feel underpaid, regardless of whether they actually are or not, they're much more likely to leave the organization. And the statistic is that 60% of people who feel that they are paid unfairly do plan to leave. And when someone plans to leave, then they don't perform at their best. So looking at compensation and figuring out some sort of communication about a way to make it feel transparent and fair to employees. It isn't just performative. It's not a gesture to be nice. It's actually an investment in the business that you will probably see intrinsic returns on. And on that note, this is just a list. Many of you probably know that there are lots of reasons to conduct a pay equity analysis in addition to this upcoming law taking place, but just in case not everybody on your board or in the C-suite understands, we've listed out some of the primary reasons to have one here. Of course, first of all, it's the right thing to do. So many companies are sharing nowadays the values that they share across the organization. And this is just one more thing to look at. Does the data show that the company values are aligned with the company's practices? And if pay disparities were publicized, would those high standards that the company espouses be undermined? What would it look like? Companies that care about fairness will want to remove the bias and favoritism from programs to show that their values actually really are being put into practice at all levels. It really helps to answer the question, is the working environment fair? We've talked about recruiting and retention. It's really big in that area. Recruiters who know that you are a proponent of pay equity can use that to attract the best talent. And if you have no pay gap, you can brag about it. You can also establish that diversity, fair hiring, and fair pay are part of your employer brand. And then we've talked before too about how it can just boost existing employee morale. So it is just a logical, proven business best practice these days. And then Holly, you'll talk a little bit about preparing for an M&A deal. That was one of the initial discussions that we had when we first started talking about this partnership. You can also use compensation equity analysis to respond to a specific risk. Like if someone has identified an issue already, figure out, is there a misconception that needs to be cleared up? And if somebody's brought up a concern, you really want to make sure you find out if those concerns are based in fact and how extreme and pervasive they may be. And Holly, you're going to cover the legal piece of this. So I'm just going to say, in terms of like staying ahead of regulations, I'm just going to say that having an analysis in place now and establishing some sort of routine process around it is also going to help prevent future disparities, because you might do an analysis now and think everything's great, but if you don't do another one later, there's room for things to go a bit haywire. Again, it just takes one new hire to kind of reset everything. So it's really important to set in place some sort of program that will allow you to look at it on a regular basis. And on anything else, Holly, you want to say on that?
No, I think I'll hit those other points later in the presentation. So I'll come back to those.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. On this note, so Salesforce in 2015, they made a big commitment to equality, and they conducted a pay equity audit, and they made the results public themselves. The analysis was not great. It did not have good results, not all roses there. They found out that they had statistically significant pay gaps between men and women that couldn't be explained by compensable factors. And they shared that information with all of their employees, and they invested $3 million to close the gender pay gap. And then they made commitments to reassess it every year. So Mark Benioff, the CEO, he talked about it publicly. We've included this quote here because he's a big compensation equity evangelist, and he thinks, in line with the law, that all companies should really be able to show statistically with data that there aren't disparities between pay that are based along race or gender lines. So just a little bit more on who's interested in this. We're just going to start by saying, so pay equity is typically driven, these kinds of analysis driven by the C-suite in coordination and cooperation with the HR department on a project level. But more and more the idea is coming from corporate counsel and from the board of directors, because they want to see what's going on. They want to track it, especially at the board. This is coming up. This topic is at almost every board governance conference that I've attended in the last couple of years, which is a good thing, because having the board involved in the analysis makes everything easier, because you get full compensation, full cooperation from the human resources team, from the finance team, from the legal team, and anybody else that needs to be involved. And you'll notice that we have the word independent at the top here. That is really important. A lot of companies do their own internal analysis, but an independent analysis not only alleviates the pressure off of the HR team and the CFO to actually conduct the analysis, it gives the employees and the stakeholders and the board more assurance about the accuracy and the neutrality of that data. And we've already talked about employees and recruiters being interested in it because they get it. They know that this is best practice. So you likely wouldn't share your data with recruiters and employees in full, but at least you'll be able to start by thinking about what are the goals and plans for communication as you go through the process. And then Holly's going to start, we're going to talk about how the process actually works now. If you think that you want to do this at your own company, how to do it yourself, how to do it with us, and the different factors that you should consider.
And just, I'll jump in there. It looks like we do have a question on, there's a new Colorado pay equity law And the question is the requirement that employers disclose hourly or salary compensation and benefits for each posting or job opening. So I think that's going to be similar to the pay band requirement that we have in California. Sounds like maybe in Colorado, you actually have to proactively provide it as opposed to waiting to be asked. But the concept is you should have developed, you know, a salary, at least a salary range on these jobs, independent of who you put in them. That's the idea. And that I think fits really nicely with this kind of analysis that goes a little deeper than many companies have done traditionally in setting salaries. Okay, let's see. Is it still you, Erin?
No, this one's you.
Okay, so the idea is we're, you know, you may be a step ahead of this and you've already looked at this and you're pretty confident that when you gather the data, you will be comfortable with the outcome. But one of the things that we've got our eye on is, could you do this in an attorney-client privileged way that that is going to allow you to look at the data initially before you have a discoverable document that could be requested in litigation. So that's something that, of course, as in-house counsel, you want to be thinking about. And then the other thought that occurs to me is sometimes when I've seen pay data in other contexts, you know, outside of litigation, I'll see what looks like anomalies, and what I gather is that sometimes this is done on a department by department basis, and there hasn't been anybody sort of looking at the big picture. So again, this is a new reporting requirement is one forcing function that's going to make sure companies are looking at the data, that there is some QC going on in how you're collecting it, and you've got validation. It's done in basically a more formal way, because if you're relying on data that's not strong and you get into discovery and you're in that deposition having to defend that data, that's not when you want to, you know, become aware of those weaknesses, right? So that's how I think about one of the ways this might play out.
I think in one of our conversations, Holly, too, you were mentioning like there might be motivation on the part of certain managers or executives to have it look a certain way. And there's so much judgment involved. We're getting low on time, so we'll probably go through the next few slides pretty quickly, but we do have one around just like the sheer number of different types of compensation that you can include in the analysis. And there's judgment. So without somebody independent saying, hey, we want to include all of these different types of compensation, it is possible that somebody in HR or an executive would say, okay, like, yeah, but let's leave out this piece of compensation. And without somebody independent coming in to say, yes, this is how we've done it, and it's fair, and it's inclusive of all different types, there could be some ways to skew the information that would be easier to do if you don't have a second set of eyes from outside the organization on it.
That's right. That's right. And having a third party really takes pressure off of your internal folks, as Erin mentioned, whether it's HR, whether it's the CFO, even legal. You know, it's hard to be the messenger sometimes with news that's got bad optics, and much, I think there can be a lot of value in having a third party involved.
So this is the M&A piece we talked about, where really interesting considerations for anybody that's thinking about merging or acquiring a target.
Right, and this is where sometimes you're being asked to share pay data. Typically, it's right at the end of the deal, right, where the acquirer is getting ready to set up their pay cycles for all these new employees, and it's sometimes just in that process. For the first time, we're seeing data that doesn't have great optics. And again, this is kind of one of those inadvertent situations where we're not thinking about pay equity. It's coming out in an indirect way. And then suddenly the acquirer is thinking, you know, we may be acquiring kind of a mess here. So something to think about there. And certainly advantageous to have that cleaned up before you get into that deal. And then we've talked already, right now, this is a requirement that's just for those with 100 employees or more. But if you're growing, you may soon be in that situation. And as we said, there may be informal ways that you'll be asked to share this data as well.
Right, okay, so I'll go quickly through this slide. Really what I want to focus on this one is just the bottom right. We haven't talked yet about the team that you form, and like any issue that you want to tackle, it's going to be most successful if you bring the right people into the mix. So our advice would be that unless you already have, a benchmarking consultant, a diversity consultant involved, the best thing to do would be to get an analysis done first. And then when you hire those consultants, you've got some really great base data to work with, and they should be part of the team that's involved in remediating any issues and working on resolving any values to data discrepancies that might exist. Also, a big part of the team should be the legal team, of course, and then company management and the executives, HR, and the CFO.
And Erin, I'll just add a quick note on this, which will be a familiar issue to this crowd, but you'll want to evaluate if you are the attorney that's involved, how comfortable are you with your attorney-client privilege status? Are you more on the business side, or do you need outside counsel if you're really going to be relying on attorney-client privilege for some of the initial analysis that you're doing as you're figuring everything out?
Right. Yeah, so we've listed out some of the legal considerations here, privilege being a huge one, and then just the level of experience and like Holly said, sometimes it's hard to communicate bad news if you're on the inside. So delegating that to outside counsel might be worth it sometimes. Getting started. So this is just a list of the steps that we would normally use. There's a lot of software out there these days that purports to look at pay equity. So you plug your information in. There are many of them. I've looked at most of them and have varying degrees of confidence in their ability to do it. If you're very simple, it might work out fine, but there are so many factors nowadays that can be, a part of a holistic compensation view. So we just recommend that you look at whatever makes sense for the systems that you already have in place. In many cases, this information is in two different systems. There's an HR system, there's like a demographic system, performance management system, and all three are different. One of the nice things about using a firm that has the high power data analytics software like we have is we can suck it all into one place, aggregate it, and then spit out some pretty nifty analyses. So we just think that these are the kind of things you want to think about getting started. This gives you an idea of the customization that can happen in working with consultants as opposed to kind of just an out-of-the-box software package. This is one of the analyses that we were able to do for one of our clients' information. You can see we can show, different states and kind of little heat map of like, where are there pay discrepancy issues, and is it in one department or one office, and is it affected by how long the person's been at the company or not? We can slice and dice the data in many different ways and answer all kinds of questions. So it's not just necessarily, are we paying men and women fairly? Give me the raw data. If there are more questions that you have about different demographics, how long are women sitting in a certain position? You can answer those questions when you have a bit more flexibility with the software that you're using. This is that list that I mentioned of different types of compensation that not all software programs can handle. Some of these, especially these non-financial benefits, taking those kinds of things into consideration requires a bit of human consideration. So these are just the kinds of things you want to think about if you're endeavoring to do your own analysis. Let me continue on here. So these are just some things that we would normally go over at the very outset of a of a meeting with our clients, whether or not you're doing an analysis on your own or with a consultant. These are the types of things that you want to be thinking about, particularly the data sources. I think that was the thing that Holly and I talked about the most at the beginning. It's like attorneys can do pay equity analyses, but the data that comes with that type of engagement is immense. And it takes a certain skill set to be able to analyze it, verify it, and really make something useful out of it and turn it into reports that are meaningful, not only for litigation, but for management analyses and decision making as well. Just about running out of time, so I'll just note a couple more things about, again, working, with somebody in order to do sort of an audit. Another thing that that accountants tend to do that the benchmarking consultants maybe do not is tie that information back to audited financial statements. So if you're a public company you undergo rigorous audits every year, SOX compliance, SOC compliance in some regards, you may find some benefit and comfort in actually tying this payroll information back to your audited financial statements. And that is something that that CPAs are able to do and have the expertise with doing, because we do those audits as well. Any last parting words, Holly?
No, I think I'll just say, of course, we'll stick around to take more questions, but I know it's such an odd time to be doing this kind of presentation with so much unprecedented events going on in the world right now. But I'm glad everyone was able to join us. I feel like there's definitely some value in being able to focus on things we have a little more control over, right, in the day-to-day. So it's really nice to see this great crowd, and I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Great. Yeah, these last few slides are just some considerations for Seiler and Farella. Of course, they're just a little plug, but also I think just qualities that you want to look for in establishing whatever relationship you're establishing to move ahead with your compensation equity analysis. They're qualities that you want to look for in whatever group you choose to partner with. So
it's always nice when your team works well together. So yeah, Erin
Exactly.
and I have clients in common, and Farella has a lot of clients in common actually with Seiler, and that makes the process a little easier too.
Yeah. Great. And our contact information is here too. We'll distribute this out afterwards if you have any questions or want to do any follow-up.
Thank you both for the presentation.